it in their own. Okay. I think we may as well start, Maxine, and if people come in late, that's fine. And then we have the recording. So,
Okay, Linda.
oh,
Before we start, I did press recording, but I don't see that people, did anybody get that message that says?
Yep. Yep.
Okay.
Got it.
Okay. So I would like to acknowledge all of the Indigenous peoples, including the Interior Salish, the Sinaiaks, and peoples who have historically hunted, fished, and lived on this land. I would also like to acknowledge the two organizations of the Indigenous peoples who share this land today, the Boundary Métis Community Association and the Boundary All Nations Aboriginal Council. So as I was thinking about tonight, I wrote down a few words yesterday. Peace does not come easy. Welcome to the last Peace Cafe of 2021, a year of fires and floods and opportunities for change, positive change for the earth and for the people on the earth, individually and collectively. Healing is necessary. Truth is necessary for each child, each woman and girl, each father and each son, each of those stranded, homeless and suffering. We end this year with a voice for healing through trauma, healing and moving always towards peace, however hard won it must be. So we'd like to welcome Sarah. Thank you so much for deciding to make your home in Grand Forks. So Sarah Salter Kelly. I'll just read what we put on our poster. It was so nice. This month, we will be joined by local author, Sarah Salter Kelly, who shares her tragic experience to offer simple, practical, and powerful insights for the metabolization of trauma in day-to-day life in her new book, Trauma as Medicine. So thank you for joining us in the Peace Cafe.
Thank you, Linda, and thank you everybody for having me. I'd like to start off as all good stories start off with a reading from the introduction of my book. Once upon a time, long, long ago, so long ago, in fact, that even the oldest of our grandmothers and grandfathers, grandmothers and grandfathers cannot remember, there existed a time and a community that honored and celebrated our deepest wounds as the passage of our soul's evolution. They knew that the initiation into higher learning came from fully embodying the energy of pain until it transformed into something inconceivable, something beyond the scope of the mind and into the wisdom of the soul. This was a process of allowing the poison of what had come to pass to rise up within, to care for this energy with wild dancing, music, crying, wailing, and other forms of embodiment until it emerged as medicine. It seems to me that these folks were in the long ago. But perhaps what I am imagining are the whispers of the ancestors yet to come, the ones who know that what the underworld has to teach us about who we are and who we are becoming is essential. This is a book for those of you who are kin to these ancient, future, past ancestors. Those of you who are tired of ingesting the poison of avoidance, denial, and spiritual bypass, and are ready to delve into the deep, dark territory of medicine making. This is a book for those of you who are ready for more. And so it is that I bring us back in time to 26 years ago from just the other day, December 7th of 1995. For those of us who have gone through a specific incident of trauma, I think all of us have gone through trauma, but for those of us who have had some very significant incidences in our lives, we can often reference them or refer to them as the moment when everything changed, when life as we knew it shifted and transitioned into what it becomes in the aftermath of going through life's big difficulties and challenges. And so on December 7th of 1995, my mother, Sheila Salter, who was a life coach, was attacked in the parking garage of her work in Edmonton, Alberta. Now, this was a really cold winter's morning. And for any of you who are familiar with the climate in Alberta, as a former Albertan, I would say that we have this idea that we're really tough because we can handle these extreme temperatures. However, when the cold becomes minus 35, minus 38, minus 40, all of a sudden you don't feel so tough anymore. All of a sudden you're in that place where you're wondering, why do I live here? And so on that morning when my mother was murdered, the cold was so sharp and so biting, it took your breath away. I remember watching the neighbors struggle to start their cars and people walking to catch the bus outside of my main floor house apartment, where they were bundled up so tightly that you couldn't even see. And I speak of the cold because it's like the cold lays the foundation for what was to come. You know, the cold, dark territory of the unknown was the circumstances that were such an important part of her loss. So she was attacked by a stranger in the parking garage of her work. It was a ground level parkade. It did not have a garage door that shut, and there was very limited lighting in it. It was a garage that held maybe about 14 cars, and she would have been attacked right when she was coming out of her car. So essentially every woman's worst nightmare, to be accosted in a dark place by a stranger. We didn't know what happened to her for about 10, 11 days. Because of the cold and because of the snow, there were very limited tracks. Her vehicle was found later that day with lots of blood in it, and as well as evidence that it had been off-road. And so there was an indication that it had been somewhere rural. However, because of all of the snow, the searches were called off after a couple of days. And so I bring us back into that time frame, and I share my story again and again and again, because part of my work is inviting people to go into what is the most difficult challenges or struggles of our own soul's journey, and how do we form a relationship with it consciously in such a way that we can begin to metabolize what has come to pass. Over those 10, 11 days that Mom was missing, there's not really anything you can do in the center of the unknown other than just breathe. Trauma in that extreme demonstrates for us how little control we have over our reality. And one of the most difficult things as humans is to meet that awareness of not being in control. I remember a friend of the family had suggested to me that I imagine I could hold her head in my lap and send her loving energy in the evening. And I didn't know anything about Reiki or energy healing at the time. However, it gave me something that I could do. And maybe if I focused on something I could do, I might have a different outcome than the one that my mind kept cycling over, right? I could direct my attention towards something that was coming from a place of love. And so over those days, eventually we had a press conference, and the press conference led to a clue that led to a perpetrator. And around the same time, my mother's body was found in an abandoned farmhouse about an hour out of Edmonton. A farmer had been going out to bring in a wood stove because it was so cold, and her body was found frozen to the ground. She'd been thrown in a window. When you find out what happened to a loved one of the most difficult things is that now you have to process what happened to the loved one. And so though our minds aren't perseverating over all of the unknown possibilities, now instead we're perseverating over all of those horrible things that come up as evidence, because it's our loved ones' bodies in homicide that tell the story of what happened. And there's nothing other than just breathing through each day that helps us to get through that. I mean, I was speaking at an Aboriginal Health and Wellness conference 2 weeks ago, and we were talking about murdered and missing women, and just the awareness that when we're in that acute place, there's no answer. It's not fixable, right? We can't fix this. And the most difficult thing, again, as humans is to be in that reality, is that this can't be fixed. This is horrible. This is difficult. My whole world is falling apart. And how do I get through this moment and the next moment? And what I noticed is remarkable about our bodies is that we only take in and process what we can in time. We have this real amazing resiliency. And so there was things over the years that I was able to visit, or memories that would come up that I was able to digest when my body was ready for it. I hadn't even read her autopsy report until 2017, and she was murdered in 1995. And though I knew many of the details from her court case, I don't think I took any of them in. And so part of my journey and why I'm feel honored to be a guest at the Peace Cafe is to offer up an example of being with these most difficult struggles and making a decision within ourselves that somehow we can come to a place of peace that's inclusive of what has come to pass, and that somehow there is a route that a way that we can walk each day that includes purpose and meaning and value, even though there are these horrible, degrading acts that humans can do to one another. And so the inquiry in my own quest, if you will, has been, how do we be with this ugliness, accept and recognize the truth of the ugliness of humanity, and still put our faith up towards higher purpose and meaning, still connect with source and trust that somehow there's direction in it. This wasn't something, obviously, that came overnight. And one of the things that I notice in those acute times of trauma is that we have to feel our feelings and address our fear and go through some of those really messy parts of grief. Grief is messy, and it can be really selfish. And in order to accept that our whole world has fallen apart, that takes time, and that takes a whole bunch of unpacking of all of our ideas of who we thought we were, so we can start to discover who we have become. Now, in April or March of 1997, there was a trial, and the person who had attacked her and murdered her was a complete stranger. He was somebody who had been on a bit of a bender all night. He had been out of prison for only 6 days. and had been hiding in the parkade maybe for half an hour. I don't even believe that my mom was necessarily his specific target. She was just the one who came into the parkade at 8:15 that morning. He was found guilty of murder one. She had been confined, there was kidnapping, she was raped, she was murdered. And one of the most difficult parts of going through a trial experience is that our loved ones are so objectified. So another piece that we have to be with is that objectification. You know, I recall the blood splatter expert speaking of my mom as the blood source. And so when he even described her death, it was termination of an active blood source. And so, you know, all of these difficult pieces that are a part of the reality of a court system, how impersonal it is, and often even the reality of how our society deals with pain, deals with trauma. I struggled with recognizing that he had been in and out of the system his whole life. And here we were dependent on the system to provide the reparation of harm done that supposedly brought forth justice. And yet at the same time, he was quite obviously a dangerous person, and it wasn't safe for him to be on the streets. And yet, for anyone else who has gone through court, it sure doesn't feel like justice is done, or that there's a sense of completion or closure, other than the fact that, you know, the person who did it has gone away. Maybe 6 weeks after after the trial, when he went to the Edmonton maximum security prison, he hung himself by his shoelaces in prison and suicided. And so here there were two people who were senselessly dead. And, you know, I was somebody who so deeply believed there was purpose and meaning in everything. I had a devout spiritual practice. I considered myself to be a full-fledged pagan at the time. I was 20. And I really believed that the goddess is what I would have referenced my relationship with Source then, that she took care of everyone that did her work. And so one of those big struggles, right, with all of us in our relationship with spirit, when we go through loss, is how can this happen, right? And that reference is what I was saying earlier. We have to do this big unpacking of all of our beliefs and ideas in order to be in that nothing and slowly allow what grows corn, what holds medicine, to come to a place of fruition. And that takes time. And I'm looking at the time as I speak. I often speak for an hour, and so I'm wanting to pull forth the important pieces in the time that we have together. And so what I would say is that there was 10 years of doing what I needed to do to grieve. And at the 10-year mark, I realized that I had never expressed any anger towards her perpetrator. I think that I was so busy ensuring that I was properly honoring my mom and grieving her loss, and also addressing any issues that I had with her that are a natural part of a mother and daughter relationship. And so at that 10-year mark, I started to recognize that I needed to address this anger. And I felt her perpetrator around me all of the time. And I was finding it quite annoying, actually. It didn't feel fair that he got to kill my mom and be around me as well, right? I like, why should I be haunted? And so I would initially use my energy to push him away. I don't want to think about you. What's the point? You're dead. And yet, as time went by, I realized that using all of this energy to push him away was a waste of time, because it didn't actually align with my values of sustainability, right? I was treating my concept of him as kind of as garbage, to use it for lack of a better metaphor. And I have this believe that there's no such thing as garbage in my day-to-day life, right? That we have to find a way to compost and sustain what it is that comes to pass in our lives. And so if I kept using all this energy to push him away, that maybe instead of expending all of that force, there was something different that I could do. Maybe since it wasn't working anyhow, I could do something different and I could call him in. And what would happen if instead of withdrawing and turning away from the person who I was most afraid of, what if instead I brought him in and had a conversation with him? And what would that look like? And this was a very organic process because I couldn't find anybody to guide me. And we're going back to, 05. I didn't even have internet. And if I did, what would I have Googled? How do you speak with your mom's perpetrator who's dead? How do I was familiar with restorative justice processes and had done a little bit of research around this, but again, he wasn't alive. And what I've come to recognize is that when we have charged energy, so when we have unresolved feelings towards another human, they don't have to be alive anyhow for us to express it. And in this act of calling him in, I created my own ceremony where I could pray and ask for support and ask for help. And I did this over an extensive amount of time, over 9 months. I didn't know that I was going to do this for 9 months. I just knew at the time that I needed to work with the elements, with earth, water, air, fire, and Akasha. And I knew that I needed to sit with it until I felt complete in my body. And so for once a week, while my twin girls were in kindergarten and my 6-month-old son napped, I had an hour and a half, right? And I thought that was a lot of time. And so in that hour and a half, I would drum, or I would sing, or I would scream out loud, or I would write a letter, or I would go on a meditation journey, using that intention to really bring focus towards any energy that kept me feeling powerless in relation to him. And that's why it took so much time, because there was a lot of energy there. And something really unexpected happened. After about 2 months of creating this process, I had this vision where I saw myself sitting on a sand wall, and I had my arm around this little boy. The little boy was maybe 11 or 12. And in front of us was a pyramid, maybe 4 stories high. And I knew that this little boy had something that he needed to address at the pyramid. And so I was comforting him because I was really reluctant to do this. And I was encouraging him in the way that a mother would encourage her son. And for those of you who have kids, you know that sensation of wrapping your whole energy body around your child. And I had this moment where I realized that that little boy was Peter Bright Eyes and that woman was me. And I had felt all of this compassion, all of this sense of love for this person. And I pulled myself out of that journey with a whole bunch of swearing initially, and even a sense of shame. How could I feel that? How could I feel compassion? This guy had, brought so much suffering into my family. What would my family think? I felt almost embarrassed that I'd had this feeling. And yet I could not deny the truth of it, that in that moment in time, in this cold winter of 06, I'd had this vision that ignited a desire to discover his humanity. Now, for a while, I was still simultaneously sitting with anger and vengeance. And so to be clear, it wasn't just like, oh, I feel positive now, yay, good things are happening. It was a lot more inner conflict. You talk about Peace Cafe, there was some war happening in here. I was like, screw you, compassion. I'm doing this ceremony to get angry. How dare you hijack my ceremony? And yet my heart would open, and I could not deny that this sense of compassion was there. And so over the course of time, it grew and it grew. And the desire or the anger that I needed to express became smaller and smaller. And in 2010, I had another vision where I felt guided to go and walk on the land of his ancestors. So the vision was quite clear that I needed to go and walk on the land of his ancestors, meet his family if possible, and understand how where he came from wove its way into my own personal story. And this is a Coles Notes version of a longer story that is in my book. And essentially, I contacted his Saddle Lake Cree Nation in Alberta and was put in touch with a former chief who was appointed to work with me. And I began a really lengthy process in learning about the history of colonization. And as much as I had a sense that I was educated, most of it came from a bit more of a privileged point of view, and a very white point of view. I had a friend I went to high school with, who's still my friend today, who's from Kahiwan First Nation, Cold Lake, Alberta. And so I knew about history, right? I had my one Native friend. And what I was discovering was all of the things that I didn't know, and all of the stories and experiences of powerlessness. I was invited to teach and do story shares through the Indian Resolution Health Services, and met many elders who would share their stories of history. I ended up even working on they have a culture camp at Blue Quill First Nations, which is the former residential schools. And I was invited to do some circles there. And so here I am doing a circle in the teepee on the land where his mother went to residential schools. In time, I met his sister when she moved back to Saddle Lake. She'd been living in BC. And we ended up becoming friends. There's friends isn't even the right word. We have a very unusual relationship, and her name is Marilyn Bright Eyes. And so we first met on the land where her older sisters and her mother went to school, and had some really deep conversations about each of our traumas and how they impacted us, and brought forth curiosity as to how can we listen to the other? How can we hold space for who the other is without needing to go into whatever defensiveness is around our own personal experiences of wounding and pain? And so often when Marilyn and I do a talk together, that's the focus is often on lived reconciliation. And so that is what will come forth. And I think I'm getting closer to time. So what I will speak to is for people who are interested in hearing more. I know I dropped a copy of my book off at the library a few months ago, and so they have one. And you can also pick them up at the Boardroom Cafe or at the art gallery. There's a lot of journal exercises, as well as ceremonies and processes that talk about forgiveness, talk about metabolization of trauma. How do we address fear? How do we, a really important part for me was knowing I was terrified of going into that parkade. So what did I do? I went into the parkade. I hate having anything hold power over me. If there's something within my control that I can address, I'm going to do it. And so I would make myself go into that parkade, and I would sing, and I would cry, and I would pray. And until it didn't have that sense of foreboding in my body, I made myself go for walks at night after about 2 years after she died, because I used to love walking at night, and I was terrified to walk at night. And the first time I did it, I had this, almost 1-year-old German Shepherd puppy. And still I was, it was like being in a cop show from the 80s. I was up against the side of buildings along the main strip because I was that afraid if there would be a bad guy. I knew that bad guys were real. There really are bad guys that will kill you. This is true. It's a true thing. And yet, do we live our lives in fear of that? Or do we find a path for ourselves to navigate it in a way that is wholehearted and as authentic as we can, and encourages us to live with freedom. And so that's the exploration of peace for me has always been to address what internal conflicts I'm carrying and how can I address those internal conflicts, because I have power over the internal conflicts. I don't always have power over what's happening around me, but if I can bring peace to some of the unresolved energy within, maybe something can change.
That was so powerful, Sarah. Thank you for sharing like such a heartfelt, traumatic experience in your life that's probably not going to leave your life for the rest of your lifetime. But I do have a question in that, so you have children yourself, and how have they been impacted by your trauma and what has helped them?
That's a really good question, Maxine. I think particularly for my daughters. So that's what I'll speak to first. I have twin girls who are 21. They were born when I was 24, so 4 years after mom died. And because they've been on their own for just a little over 2 years now, and I'm going through a bit of empty nest stuff, I've had a little bit of space to process and to consider that. And so my answers would even be different now than 2 years ago. Initially, when they were old enough that I had to teach them stranger danger. So when they were 2, let's say, and I realized that we needed to have a conversation about, you don't get into a stranger's car, or you don't take candy from strangers. They were fascinated by the idea that there were these bad guys that would take you. Right? They're like, well, why would they do that? Where do they take you? What do they do? Like all of these questions that 2 or 3-year-olds are going to ask. And I noticed for myself, I had to be really mindful of whether or not I was projecting my own fear of what might happen, rather than just teaching them basic life skills. And I definitely was projecting a lot of fear. I was terrified somebody would take them. And with having twins, like they would run in different directions at once, right? And, and I was the parent who thought it was wrong to put them on leashes. So, in hindsight, I probably would do something different now. But I often brought them places where it was just an open field so that it would be safe and I could see everything. So what I noticed for myself is I had to meet that fear. If I was afraid somebody could take my children and that had power over me, I needed to find it inside of myself and be with that fear. So when I say meet it, I would do something that is kind of like a shamanic journey, which is similar to a led meditation, where I would just go into a deep place of meditation and find that feeling. Here's the feeling of someone's going to take my kids. Here's the feeling that I'm powerless. What if this does happen? What if this is true and I can do nothing about it? And by investigating that feeling, it didn't have quite as much power over me. I was able to then, instead of being afraid of the feeling, I could be conscious and rational. Okay, there's a pretty good chance that's not going to happen. Pretty good chance we're more likely to get hit by a car. Not that I want that to happen, but being conscious that the likelihood was very slim. And as they became young women, I brought them up in a really rural environment, about an hour southwest of Edmonton. We had a hobby farm, a 7-acre hobby farm. Our closest neighbor was a quarter of a mile. So they could run and play free. We moved there from the time they were 6 to 19. And I didn't have to worry about them once we were out there, but they still went into the city. And so I think it's more of now that they're in many ways out from the safety of my mother umbrella, that they're starting to recognize that they do have fears or energy that they need to address themselves as adults. And so, one of my twin daughters has always been afraid of going into the dark alone. And her and her sister's bedrooms were in our basement at our old house. And if her twin wasn't there, she wouldn't go downstairs. If she didn't have her cat or her husky, if she had her cat or her husky, she was okay. And so we were talking about this more recently. And again, to how can we address this so that you feel safe and it doesn't hold power over you? And so to the best of my ability in encouraging them to be empowered and strong young women. And yet, again, this is true. It's also true that if you're walking into a dark place by yourself, I'm still uncomfortable when I go into parkades, or if I'm, the closest town to me in Edmonton, or in the Alberta county I lived in was called Wetaskiwin, and the shopping grocery store parking lot would be this big giant parking lot, and you're pushing your cart over all the snow, and I get to the edge of where my vehicle was and feel somebody following me. And I would have to check in with that trigger because it's a trigger for me. And initially my conscious mind would be like, okay, if I have to, I got my key here. I'll leave the groceries and I can run here. So I needed my escape plan. Then I could take a deep breath, stop, turn, look, and face whatever it was that I assumed I was afraid of. And I mean, I've been mugged, I've been followed. All of those things were a part of my teen years and growing up. And so I learned that it was always safer to turn and look.
Thank you, Sarah. I'm thinking about many things as you've been talking. One of the things that, as soon as you mentioned this parkade, I remember in 1995, I went to the women's conference outside of Beijing, and I went to a session with 2 women architects, and they were talking about how important it was that women were involved in architecture, in design, because there should not be dark places. Everyone should be safe. And things had to actually be designed in such a way that women would be safe there. Anyway, that's just one of the many thoughts I've had. Another one is that what you're describing with, being the daughter of a woman that was killed this way, this intergenerational trauma affects so many people. I just watched a documentary about Holocaust survivors and all of these things that are happening in so many different ways around the world and have been happening for a long time. Your experiences and what you have done with your trauma is really remarkable. Getting to know the people whose family that man came from, and understanding really how difficult his own life must have been. Anyway, thank you. Lots to unpack and just listening to your journey.
Thank you for that, Linda. It makes me think, I love historical fiction, and recently I read 2 books by Ruta Sepetys, I believe is her last name, and they were about what happened in Russia after or during the Second World War. And I have, my grandfather was from Belarus and the Baltics. And so thinking about, and he came here right before the Second World War as a boy, but thinking about what my Slavic family went through as far as the famines and just the horrendous acts towards other humans. And I have a fascination with it. When Mom went missing, I even rented the whole Roots series from the library and watched it in a week. Do you remember that series? It was just, I didn't see the relationship at the time, but in hindsight, this deep curiosity of why do we do horrible things to each other? And perhaps through investigating and educating myself, I can be a part of supporting people to make different choices, or process or digest some of that trauma. And I think it's also important to note, so thinking about what you said, Linda, about the generational trauma, as well as we don't always have a single one-off event, that sometimes it's not what happened, it's what didn't happen. Sometimes it's the need for a sense of connection or belonging in a family of origin that was just never there. And so it's really important also not to compare our traumas, that if there's something inside of you where you don't feel free to be yourself, that each of us can investigate that and explore, what is that connected to? And is there something that's within my power to notice or address that can help to elicit freedom? And I think that historically in our cultures, and whether this is related to our own ancestral traumas, that when something is horrible or uncomfortable, we think if we go back into it, we're going to have the same feelings or the same experiences as that first time. I mean, it took me at least 10 years before I could speak about my mom's homicide to strangers, and definitely not candidly like I can now, 26 years later. But what happens is when we have all these things that we don't talk about, it's almost like we're wearing horse blinders, and we only see the world from this point of view. And the older we get, the more that impacts us, and the less and less and less we can see. And we become really stuck in our need to be safe. We become stuck in our need for things to only be this certain way, because if I look at all of those things, I don't know what will happen. And the encouragement is to consider that maybe we can look at them one thing at a time in a way that's safe for our own nervous systems and for our own bodies, so that it doesn't need to re-traumatize us. However, we can release the energy that is connected to it. Any other questions?
Sarah, this is Vicky. Oh, wow, I just honor your courage. Yeah. I grew up in a violent, abusive household. And so, it's a very different story, but a lot of this rings true. And it has really made a difference to be able to move from that place of deep wounding to compassion. And by seeing my father as a soul being, like I actually feel like part of what I needed to do was disinherit him as my father. And when he died, I was so relieved, because he had caused so much harm to so many people. And I didn't particularly feel guilty or anything about that. I loved my father. I know he loved me. But when he died, it was interesting for me to hear about you talking about this person coming near you and that sense. And when he died, I couldn't track him anywhere. Everyone else who's died that's close to me, I can sort of track them. There's a thread that I feel like I can connect with them. Felt like he had gone into some desert or something, and I had no idea what was going on with him. And then, like, this is years again, similarly, of therapy and so on. He reappeared in my life as a young man before he ended up in the abyss he ended up in, because I think he was, for whatever reason, unable to face his own issues. And just that place of meeting him there was so liberating, I hope, to him as well in his spiritual path. And it certainly was for me. And, this generation in my family, this is not, it's been broken in this generation. Like, this does not carry on. The alcoholism, the abuse, the violence, it's ended here with my generation. And it's really, it's really good work. Two of us are Baha'is, one's a recovering alcoholic, and he's doing his work in AA, and none of us are perpetuating this. And this is, this is what a spiritual path can do. Yeah. And I so appreciate you saying, it's so true that peace starts here.
I really appreciate that share, Vicki. It makes me think about, a big piece of liberation was when I realized I wasn't better than him.
Yes.
And I was surprised to notice that I thought that. But after I had that experience of compassion and started to think of his humanity, I started to be curious about who could he be other than just the bad guy in the parkade, or what I had read in the newspaper as, a person who was a product of the system. He was someone's kid, brother. And so that awareness then that I thought I was superior because I didn't kill people. So I must be good, right? And often we want to position ourselves so that we're vilifying whoever the other is, right? If there's this bad guy here, then we're good over here. And we understand that duality because that's played out so much in our world. So rare is it, that recognition that actually we're part of the same thing.
Yeah.
And so it is that deep awareness of we're both equal souls. My soul's not worth more. And if we're both equal souls, then isn't that interesting how our lives turned out so differently? And it is. That's the equalizer, I think, in shared humanity. Jennifer, did you have a question?
No. Many thoughts are going through my mind, but a very, very powerful presentation. I thank you for that.
Okay, thank you, Jennifer.
But I don't have a question. I might have in a couple of days.
That's
Mull
often how it
more.
goes. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. I think what I'll do before we finish then is even speak just briefly, if it's possible, to speak briefly about forgiveness, just because that often comes up when I'm doing a talk, is just the awareness that forgiveness is such an organic process for all of us. And for a long time, in my own experience, I didn't even contemplate it until after that experience with compassion. And I think a lot of that was because I needed to know that I wasn't letting my mom down or doing wrong by considering forgiveness. I needed to know that it didn't mean I was saying what he did was okay. And I wasn't saying that he won. There's all these funny different feelings that come up with forgiveness. I needed to ensure that I had grieved and honored my mother to the best of my ability before I even contemplated it, because she took precedence over anything in relation to him in those first 10 years. And yet it started to come up in my inquiry, I think, just naturally. And I think it does for all of us when we're on a spiritual path and we're considering freedom. There's no bypass around forgiveness. You can't, it's common. And what actually happened for me is that I had been thinking about it for a while. And my mother had an affirmation on her bedroom mirror at the time of death that said, I forgive myself, I forgive everyone, I am free. So obviously she had a keen love of forgiveness, right? So I at about the 10, 11, 12-year mark, as I was thinking about this more intentionally, I was doing a training program that was outside on some wild land in northern Alberta. And in the process, we were honoring our teachers by making a mandala out of things that we found in nature. And with each object that we had collected as we created our mandalas, you would pick it up and you would blow your connection with that teacher into the mandala as a way of honoring it and placing it down. And, I went through my objects, which I had gathered intuitively without knowing what would represent what, just trusting my instincts. And I came to this final object. And as soon as I picked it up, I got those shivers that go down your whole body. And I knew that Peter Bright Eyes was one of my greatest teachers. I knew that I would be lying if I was to deny the fact that what had come into my life because of my mother's homicide were the greatest things that I could learn in this lifetime. And so not in any way, obviously, that I was grateful that she had died in that way, but it is what happened. And through it, I had learned shared humanity, and through it, I had learned compassion. And I knew in that moment I had to forgive him. And so it was through the act of naming him as one of my greatest teachers, and that I was able to say those words out loud for the first time, that I forgive you. And, and a lengthier version of the story, which is in the book, is that shortly thereafter, he became my spirit guide. That's all I can say for today.
Thank you, Sarah. Like, I know that you do workshops and you do retreats,
Yeah.
and I'm sure we'll see your advertising at some point when you're holding some locally here. It's really a lot to process. It's been just an incredible learning opportunity, I think, for all of us to hear, the processes that you went through and where you are now and what you can offer others.
Yeah, thank you, Maxine. And I do have a clinical practice in my house right now. And so that's important to note. And yes, with the pandemic, I haven't set up a schedule for workshops for next year, but I am looking at some different retreat center spaces locally and in the greater Kootenay area.
Yeah, because I was saying if this was a retreat, even if it was an online retreat, we would have to go and process this before we could come back and
Right.
and really sink our teeth into it for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I feel I was a little nervous just because you guys are my community now. You might not know that, but since I live here now, I might see you at the grocery store. And so often I do talks. And unless it's people who are taking my programs, I don't see them again. And so there's something that's more vulnerable in sharing with, again, we might also be sharing the line at the BILO. And I'll say hi.
For sure.
I will.
Well, we're really, again, very happy that you have brought all of your experience to this last Peace Cafe of this year. It's been quite a year for the world. And your experience is one that can teach us all to think about our own pathways, what each of us have gone through in our own lives, and reach a place of more compassion, more forgiveness, and more hope.
Thank you, Linda. Yes, thank you so much for inviting me.
And thank you again, Lizanne. We really appreciate that the collaboration that the library has with our local Baha'i community to bring such diverse speakers to this platform for social discourse. And we really appreciate Lizanne, the library, our guests, and all the
Mm.
participants.
Mm.
And we look forward to 2022,
Mhm.
meeting new people.
Thank you, Sarah. That was amazing. Your journey has been just so inspiring, and a big, big thank you.
Mm. Thank you, Vera.
Okay, I guess that wraps us up for today, and maybe we might end up having to have a debrief of all of this some point in another Peace Cafe down the road.
Yeah. And I think something important to note too is that if anybody wants to drop me an email, so sometimes questions will come up, and I know I just unpacked a whole bunch of intense information in a short amount of time. So you can always private message me. It's just my name I'll put it in the chat at gmail.com. So just Sarah Salter Kelly at gmail.com. And absolutely, I'd be more than willing to answer any questions that come up later, or anything that maybe poked you in a certain way. That yeah, and again, thank you so much for inviting me. I've looked at the ads for Peace Cafe a few times. I wanted to check out, I think it was the last speaker, but I was out of town, and so you'll find me joining in 2022.
I think you'll find some recordings. The library record as well as they did tonight.
Okay.
So if you have something that you want to watch in your own time, I know for sure the last one was recorded.
Okay, good. Thank you, Shelley. That's good to know. And I would find that out by messaging you, Lizanne.
They're on the library's YouTube channel, so I think you just need to either Google YouTube Peace Cafe, and I believe there's about 4 or 5 of them, different recordings that are up there.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank
And
you.
thank you for your time too.
Inspiring. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night, everyone.
Good
night.
night. Blessings to you all.
Bye-bye.